He handed me divorce papers while I was still bleeding from the incision where they took my kidney out. Now stick with me until the end because what happened next wasn't something anyone saw coming, including me. My name is Olivia, and for 5 years I believed I was building a happy marriage with my husband, Beckett. We had a comfortable life together. It wasn't perfect, but I thought every couple had difficult moments. Whenever something felt off between us, I convinced myself it was only stress from work or the normal ups and downs of marriage. I trusted him completely and never imagined he was keeping something from me. Everything changed when Beckett's mother, Judith, was diagnosed with kidney failure. The doctors said she needed a transplant quickly. One by one, family members were tested, but none of them could donate. The entire family was devastated. Beckett came to me with tears in his eyes and begged me to get tested. He said I was their last chance and that he couldn't imagine losing his mother. I agreed without taking time to think about myself. Donating a kidney wasn't a small decision, but I loved my husband and I wanted to save his mother's life. Deep inside, I also believed this would finally make me feel like a true part of his family. I hoped Judith would accept me completely, and I believed Beckett would always remember the sacrifice I was making for the woman who gave him life. A few days later, the doctors called with the results. I was the only compatible match. Everyone celebrated the news with tears of relief. They called me a blessing and thanked me over and over. Watching their happiness made me believe I had made the right choice. As the surgery date came closer, I signed endless forms, completed every medical test, and listened carefully as the doctors explained the risks. I smiled through my fear because I wanted everyone else to feel hopeful. Every time I looked at Beckett, I expected to see gratitude, but instead he seemed distracted. He spent more time looking at his phone than talking to me. Whenever I asked if something was wrong, he simply said he was worried about his mother. The night before the operation, I barely slept. My mind was filled with questions about the surgery and what recovery would be like. Beckett sat quietly beside the window, emotionally distant, and I convinced myself he was exhausted from everything we had been through. I never imagined that while I was preparing to give away a part of my body, he was already preparing to walk away from our marriage. The morning of the surgery arrived faster than I was ready for. A nurse gently woke me before sunrise and began preparing me for the operation. My hands felt cold and my heart wouldn't stop racing. Even though I had signed every form and spoken with the doctors several times, the reality of giving away one of my kidneys suddenly felt overwhelming. I looked toward Beckett, hoping he would calm my fears. He squeezed my hand for a moment and told me everything would be fine, but his attention quickly drifted back to his phone. The medical team rolled my bed toward the operating room while bright lights passed above me. I remember taking one last deep breath before the anesthesia slowly pulled me into darkness. When I finally opened my eyes again, everything hurt. My mouth was dry, my body felt heavy, and a sharp pain spread across my side every time I tried to move. Machines surrounded me, filling the room with steady beeps. A nurse noticed I was awake and assured me the surgery had gone as planned. She smiled and told me that Judith's transplant had been successful. Hearing that brought me a sense of relief. No matter how much pain I was in, I believed helping save her life had been worth it. The first couple of days were harder than I expected. Even sitting up in bed took effort. Every small movement reminded me that my body needed time to heal. The nurses encouraged me to walk a few careful steps, and each one felt like climbing a mountain. Still, I kept telling myself recovery would get easier. Beckett stayed at the hospital most of the time, but something about him felt different. He rarely looked me in the eyes for long. During conversations with the doctors, he often stepped into the hallway before they finished speaking. His phone seemed more important than anything happening in my room. Every few minutes he checked the screen or quietly answered messages. Whenever I asked if everything was all right, he blamed work or said he was overwhelmed by everything that had happened. I wanted to believe him. His mother had just gone through a major transplant and I knew people handled stress differently. I convinced myself that once Judith recovered, things between us would return to normal. A few days later, my brother Marcus came to visit. He brought fresh clothes, helped adjust my pillows, and stayed beside me while we talked. I noticed his eyes following Beckett whenever he left the room yet again to answer another call. Marcus looked concerned, as if he wanted to say something, but he held his tongue. Before leaving, he simply told me to focus on getting stronger. That evening I was still weak from the surgery and drifting in and out of sleep when the door slowly opened. Through my blurry vision, I saw Beckett walk into the room. His face showed no emotion. In one hand, he carried a large sealed envelope as he quietly made his way toward my hospital bed. I smiled weakly when Beckett walked into my room. Even though I was exhausted and still in pain, I thought he had come to check on me. Instead of speaking, he stood beside my bed and stared at me for a few long seconds. His face was impossible to read. Then he placed the envelope gently on my lap. At first, I thought it was hospital paperwork or insurance documents. My hands trembled as I opened it. The pain medication made everything feel slow and unreal. When I finally looked at the first page, my heart stopped. The bold words across the top were impossible to mistake. They were divorce papers. I looked up at Beckett, certain there had been some terrible mistake. "What is this?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. He didn't look surprised by my reaction. Instead, he folded his arms and spoke in a calm, emotionless voice. He told me he had been unhappy for a long time. He said our marriage hadn't been working and that he didn't want to keep living a lie. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, as if he had practiced it many times before walking into my room. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I reminded him that I had just gone through major surgery. I could barely sit up without help. My body was still recovering from giving his mother a kidney. None of that seemed to matter to him. Then he said the words that shattered everything I believed about my marriage. He told me that now his mother was stable, there was no reason to keep pretending anymore. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My mind replayed every conversation we had before the surgery. Every promise. Every tear. Every time he thanked me for saving Judith. Suddenly the truth became painfully clear. He hadn't changed his mind overnight. He had already decided to leave me. He simply waited until after the transplant because he still needed something only I could give. The room began spinning. My chest tightened and the steady beeping from the heart monitor suddenly became fast and loud. A nurse rushed inside after hearing the alarms. She immediately checked my blood pressure and asked Beckett to step away from the bed. I heard someone calling for another nurse while they tried to calm me down. Beckett didn't argue. He didn't apologize or explain himself. He simply watched for a brief moment, then turned toward the door. I called his name, hoping he would stop, hoping he would look back and tell me this was some terrible joke. He never did. Without another word, he walked out of the room and disappeared down the hallway. The nurses stayed beside me until my breathing slowed, but nothing could ease the pain that wasn't physical. I lay there staring at the papers resting across the hospital blanket, realizing that in a single moment I had lost a kidney, my marriage, and the future I thought I was fighting to protect. After I was discharged from the hospital, I had nowhere I wanted to go except my brother Marcus's house. The thought of returning to the home I had shared with Beckett felt impossible. Every room would remind me of the life I believed we were building together. My body was still sore from the surgery, and even walking up a few steps left me exhausted. Marcus insisted I stay with him for as long as I needed, giving me the quiet space to recover. The first few days passed slowly. I focused on healing, taking my medication and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. My emotions changed by the hour. Sometimes I cried without warning. Other times I simply stared out the window, wondering how my marriage had ended so suddenly. As the shock began to fade, questions took its place. Beckett's behavior during the weeks before the surgery no longer seemed like ordinary stress. Small moments I had ignored started returning to me. The late-night messages. The excuses for coming home late. The way he always kept his phone turned away whenever I walked into the room. Marcus helped me gather a few of my belongings from the house while Beckett was away. As we packed my things, I noticed an old phone hidden inside the back of a dresser drawer. I had never seen it before. It wasn't broken or forgotten. It had been charged recently. My confusion only grew. While sorting through paperwork, I also found several bank statements showing withdrawals from our joint account that I couldn't explain. The amounts weren't huge, but they happened regularly over several months. There was also paperwork for a storage unit rented under Beckett's name. I had never heard him mention it, and I couldn't imagine why he would need one without telling me. That evening, Marcus finally admitted something he had been keeping to himself. Months earlier, while meeting a client at a restaurant downtown, he had seen Beckett having dinner with a woman named Paige Winslow. At the time, he hoped there was an innocent explanation. He didn't want to accuse my husband without proof, so he stayed silent. Hearing that felt like another blow, but I still wanted to believe there had to be some misunderstanding. Then I found the piece that destroyed every remaining doubt. Tucked inside a folder with old receipts was a hotel receipt dated exactly 2 weeks before my surgery. It listed 1 room, 2 guests, and Beckett's name. My hands shook as I read it again and again, hoping I had missed something. Instead, everything finally fit together. The distance, the hidden phone, the missing money, and the strange behavior were all part of the same story. Beckett hadn't decided to leave me after the transplant. He had already planned his future long before I entered the operating room. He simply waited until his mother had my kidney before ending our marriage, making sure he got everything he wanted before walking away. A few days after finding the hotel receipt, I realized I couldn't keep wondering what Judith knew. I needed answers even if they hurt. My body was still healing and every step reminded me of the surgery, but I drove to her house anyway. During the trip, I kept telling myself there had to be something I didn't understand. Maybe she had no idea what Beckett had done. Maybe she would be as shocked as I had been. When Judith opened the door, she looked healthier than she had in months. The transplant had given her strength back. Seeing her standing there should have made me happy, but instead it reminded me of everything I had sacrificed. She invited me inside, and for a few moments neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been weighing on me since the hospital. Did you know Beckett was planning to leave me? Judith lowered her eyes before answering. That brief silence told me more than words ever could. She admitted she had known about Paige for months. She said Beckett had confessed that he wanted out of the marriage long before the surgery. I waited for her to tell me she had tried to stop him or convince him to be honest with me. Those words never came. Instead, she calmly said, "Marriages end, but a mother only gets one life." I stared at her, unable to believe what I had just heard. She continued speaking as if she were explaining something completely reasonable. She said she couldn't risk losing her chance at a transplant. If Beckett had left me before the operation, I might have changed my mind about donating. She believed staying quiet was the safest choice. Her honesty hurt more than any lie could have. Everything suddenly became clear. The grateful smiles, the hugs, the promises that I would always be family, they had all depended on one thing. As long as I was willing to give them what they needed, I mattered. The moment the surgery was over, my place in their lives no longer had value. I asked her how she could watch me risk my health while knowing my marriage was already over. She didn't have an answer that made sense. She only repeated that she had done what any mother would do to survive. At that moment, I understood that I would never receive the apology I deserved. The room felt smaller with every passing second. I realized there was nothing left to discuss. No explanation could undo what had been done, and no excuse could erase the betrayal. Without raising my voice or shedding another tear, I stood up and walked toward the front door. Judith quietly called my name once, but I didn't stop. As I stepped outside, I felt the weight of heartbreak slowly giving way to something stronger. I had walked into that house searching for comfort. I left with certainty. They hadn't simply broken my trust. They had used my kindness to get what they wanted, and I was finally done waiting for them to admit it. Leaving Judith's house changed something inside me. For days I had been living with sadness, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart. Now I understood that crying over people who had already made their choices would not change anything. I still carried the pain of losing my marriage, but I no longer wanted to remain the helpless person they expected me to be. Marcus suggested I speak with an attorney before signing anything Beckett had sent me. At first, I wasn't sure it would make a difference. I thought divorce papers were simply the end of the story. Still, I agreed to meet with Nolan Ashby, an attorney known for handling difficult family cases. Nolan listened carefully without interrupting as I explained everything from the kidney donation to the divorce papers waiting for me in my hospital bed. He read through the documents Beckett had delivered and asked several questions about the timeline. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair for a moment before speaking. He told me the law could not repair a broken heart or erase betrayal. But if someone intentionally concealed important facts while another person made a life-changing medical decision, that deception could become legally important depending on the evidence. He made it clear that every case depended on proof, not emotions. Those words gave me something I hadn't felt in weeks. A reason to keep moving forward. For the first time since the surgery, I stopped thinking only about what I had lost. I started thinking about what I could prove. Marcus helped me organize everything we had already found. We gathered copies of our bank statements showing months of unexplained withdrawals from our joint account. We added records connected to the storage unit Beckett had rented without my knowledge. Marcus also recovered text messages from an old backup that helped establish the timeline of Beckett's secret relationship. I carefully placed the hotel receipt into a folder with the rest of the documents. Every date seemed to connect with another piece of the story. The evidence showed that Beckett's plans had been in motion long before I entered the operating room. The hardest piece to include was Judith's admission. As soon as I returned from her house, I had written down every word I could remember while the conversation was still fresh in my mind. Her statement that she stayed silent because she feared losing the transplant became one of the most important parts of the timeline. The growing stack of papers no longer represented memories. They represented facts. Each document reminded me that this wasn't simply about a marriage ending. It was about choices that had been hidden from me while I agreed to make one of the biggest sacrifices of my life. By the end of that week, my focus had completely changed. I was still healing physically, and some mornings the pain from the surgery was stronger than others. But emotionally, I had stopped waiting for apologies that would never come. Instead of grieving the future they had taken from me, I began preparing for the truth to speak for itself. Once everything had been organized, Nolan contacted Beckett's attorney and suggested a mediation meeting. The reason given was simple. We wanted to discuss the divorce and reach a peaceful agreement without dragging everything into a long legal fight. Beckett accepted almost immediately. From what Nolan heard, he believed I was finally ready to sign the papers and move on without asking difficult questions. The meeting took place in a quiet conference room. Nolan sat beside me while a recorder rested in the center of the table to document the discussion. Beckett walked in looking completely relaxed. He barely acknowledged me before taking his seat. His confidence made it obvious he expected this to be over quickly. After everyone settled down, Beckett repeated that our marriage had simply fallen apart and that there was nothing more to discuss. He acted as though the divorce was an unfortunate but ordinary ending. Listening to him speak so casually about everything that had happened only strengthened my resolve. When he finished, Nolan nodded toward me. I opened the folder I had carried into the room and slowly placed the first document on the table. It was the hotel receipt dated 2 weeks before my kidney surgery. Beckett glanced at it but immediately claimed it meant nothing. He said it was a business meeting and insisted I was trying to create problems where none existed. Without arguing, I placed another document beside it. This one showed payments for the storage unit I had never known existed. Beckett shifted in his chair and said he had rented it for personal belongings because our garage was too full. His explanations came quickly, but they sounded less certain than before. Then Nolan presented copies of the financial records showing repeated withdrawals from our joint account during the same period. The dates matched the evidence already sitting on the table. Beckett stopped answering as confidently. He looked toward his attorney before speaking again. Finally, I took a deep breath and spoke about my visit to Judith's house. I repeated her exact words as clearly as I could remember. Marriages end, but a mother only gets one life. The room fell completely silent. I explained how Judith admitted she had known about Paige for months and stayed quiet because she believed I might refuse the transplant if I learned the truth beforehand. Those words carried more weight than anything else I had presented. For the first time since the meeting began, Beckett's calm expression disappeared. He lowered his eyes and struggled to respond. He started denying that his mother had ever said such a thing, but the confidence he had walked in with was gone. I looked directly at him and finally said everything I had carried inside since the hospital. I deserved the truth before I risked my life for your family. You took away my choice. No one interrupted. No one argued. At that moment, I wasn't speaking as the woman he had abandoned. I was speaking as someone who refused to let her sacrifice be erased. And for the first time since the surgery, Beckett had nothing left to say. In the days after the mediation, the conversation shifted from emotions to evidence. Nolan carefully organized every document we had collected and compared the dates with our financial records. The more closely everything was examined, the clearer the pattern became. Money from Beckett and my shared bank account had been used to cover expenses connected to Paige. There were restaurant payments, hotel charges, and purchases that lined up with the months he claimed he was working late or spending extra time helping his mother through her illness. For the first time, Paige was identified by name in the legal discussions. She was no longer just someone I suspected existed. The records connected her to the timeline that had already been established. Every document supported the same conclusion. While I was preparing to donate my kidney, Beckett had already started building another life. Nolan presented the financial evidence to Beckett's attorney, making it impossible to dismiss the spending as simple mistakes. The transactions had occurred repeatedly over several months. Together they painted a picture that was difficult to explain away. No dramatic argument followed. The paperwork spoke more clearly than raised voices ever could. Not long afterward, Judith asked if we could meet privately. I agreed, wanting to hear what she had to say. When she arrived, she looked uneasy. The confidence she once carried had disappeared. She admitted she was worried about how the situation might affect her reputation within the family and community. She also feared people would question the circumstances surrounding the transplant once they learned the full timeline. Then she made an offer. She said she was willing to provide me with a generous amount of money if I agreed to settle everything quietly and stop pursuing the matter any further. She insisted it would be better for everyone if the family could move on without more attention. I listened patiently before answering. I told her this had never been about money. No payment could erase the choices that had been made before my surgery. I hadn't spent weeks recovering just to place a price on my dignity. What mattered to me was honesty. I wanted the truth acknowledged instead of hidden behind convenient excuses. She nodded without arguing, perhaps realizing there was nothing she could say that would change my mind. Over the following weeks, the story spread naturally among relatives and mutual friends. No one posted accusations online, and I never tried to embarrass Beckett publicly. People simply talked. Family members compared what they knew, asked questions, and slowly pieced together the sequence of events. At birthdays, holiday dinners, and family gatherings, Beckett noticed the difference. Conversations became quieter when he entered the room. People who had once praised him now struggled to meet his eyes. Some offered polite greetings, but the respect he had enjoyed for years had quietly disappeared. I took no satisfaction in watching his reputation fade. I had never wanted revenge. I only wanted the truth to stand where lies had once been, and in the end that truth spoke louder than I ever needed to. By the time the final divorce meeting arrived, I felt very different from the woman who had opened an envelope in a hospital bed with shaking hands. The pain of betrayal had not disappeared, but it no longer controlled every thought. Weeks of recovery, difficult conversations, and careful preparation had given me something I had almost lost after the surgery: confidence in myself. With Nolan's guidance, every detail of the settlement was reviewed carefully. The paperwork reflected the complete timeline of our marriage, the financial decisions that had been hidden from me, and the events surrounding my kidney donation. Nothing was left vague or pushed aside. I wanted every important fact recorded honestly, not because I wished to punish Beckett, but because I refused to let my story be rewritten. When everything was finalized, I signed the papers with a steady hand. The settlement recognized both the financial impact of the marriage and the extraordinary circumstances that surrounded its ending. Walking out of the office, I didn't feel victorious. Instead, I felt lighter. A long chapter of my life had finally come to an end. Soon afterward, I rented a small apartment across town. It wasn't large or luxurious, but every corner belonged to me. I chose the furniture myself, arranged the shelves the way I liked, and filled the kitchen with simple things that made the space feel warm. For the first time in years, I was creating a home that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. My recovery continued little by little. The scar across my side became less noticeable with each passing week. Physical therapy and regular walks helped me regain my strength. Simple tasks that had once exhausted me slowly became part of my normal routine again. Every step forward reminded me that my body had survived something difficult and was determined to heal. The emotional recovery took longer. For years, I had defined myself as Beckett's wife. I had measured my value by how much I could give to the people around me. Losing my marriage forced me to ask a question I had avoided for a long time. Who was I without that title? The answer didn't come all at once. I found it in quiet mornings with a cup of coffee, in returning to work when I was ready, and in spending time with Marcus without constantly talking about the past. I started enjoying small moments again without feeling guilty for moving forward. I also stopped blaming myself for choices that had never been mine. Their deception belonged to them, not to me. My decision to help someone in need came from kindness, and I refused to let their betrayal turn that kindness into something I regretted. One evening, I caught my reflection in the apartment window. The scar was still there, though it had already begun to fade. Instead of seeing a reminder of everything I had lost, I saw proof that I had survived. My future was no longer tied to the people who had broken my trust. It belonged entirely to me, and for the first time in a long while, that thought filled me with peace. Several months passed and life slowly settled into a rhythm that finally felt peaceful. My strength had returned and I threw myself back into my work as a physical therapist. Helping people recover reminded me every day that healing takes time, patience, and determination. My patients often celebrated small improvements, and without realizing it, I was celebrating my own progress alongside them. Outside of work, I rebuilt the relationships that had carried me through my darkest days. Marcus remained my biggest source of support, and we spent more time together than we ever had before. We laughed again without every conversation returning to the past. Friends who had quietly stood beside me throughout the divorce continued to remind me that real family is not always defined by marriage or blood alone. Their kindness helped me see that my life had never been as empty as I once feared. I no longer searched for updates about Beckett. Whatever happened after our divorce was no longer my responsibility. Still, news has a way of finding people. Through mutual friends, I eventually heard that his relationship with Paige was already falling apart. The excitement that had once brought them together didn't survive the questions, whispers, and damaged trust that followed. I didn't celebrate the news. I simply accepted it as another consequence of choices neither of them could escape. One afternoon, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately. It was Judith. For a moment, I stared at the screen without answering. A voicemail arrived a few minutes later. Her voice sounded older and quieter than I remembered. She said she wanted to talk one last time and hoped we could find some kind of peace before moving forward. I listened to the message only once. There was nothing left to discuss. Forgiveness didn't require reopening doors that needed to stay closed. I wished her good health in my heart, but I knew our lives had reached their natural ending. I deleted the voicemail without returning the call. That decision didn't come from anger. It came from acceptance. Some chapters are meant to stay finished. One quiet morning, I stood in my apartment holding a warm cup of coffee as the sun slowly rose beyond my window. Soft light filled the room and everything felt calm. Months earlier, I had watched daylight enter a hospital room while wondering if my life had been destroyed forever. Now I stood in a place that belonged completely to me. Almost without thinking, I touched the faint scar along my side. It was still there, but it no longer reminded me of betrayal. It reminded me of survival, strength, and the woman I had become after everything fell apart. I smiled as the sunlight reached the room and realized I wasn't waiting for closure anymore. I already had it. I gave him my kidney. He gave me back my life, just not the way he meant to.